In this video, we're taking a closer look at Black Panther, a movie that does much more than tell the story of a superhero. At its core, it's about a young king stepping into a role filled with expectations, responsibilities, and difficult decisions. As he tries to protect Wakanda and honor the legacy left behind by previous generations, he begins discovering that some of the biggest challenges don't come from enemies, but from the questions that have been ignored for far too long. While the action, technology, and world of Wakanda are some of the film's biggest highlights, what interested me most was the way the story explores leadership, tradition, identity, and the price of choosing between protecting the past and embracing the future. So today, I'll be talking about the story, the performances, the action, the direction, the cinematography, the world building, and some interesting facts behind the film to see why Black Panther became one of the most talked about superhero movies ever made. Let's get started. In this video, we're taking a closer look at Black Panther, a movie that arrived with enormous expectations and somehow managed to exceed most of them. Before watching it for the first time, I expected a solid superhero film with great action and impressive visuals. What I didn't expect was a movie that would spend so much time exploring leadership, responsibility, identity, and the consequences of isolation. That's one of the reasons Black Panther stands out even years after its release. Beneath all the action and spectacle, there's a surprisingly thoughtful story about what kind of leader someone chooses to become when the entire future of their nation rests on their shoulders. The movie begins by introducing the audience to Wakanda, and honestly, this is where I think the film immediately separates itself from many other superhero movies. Most fictional places in comic book films feel like locations. Wakanda feels like a living world. From the very first scenes, there's a sense that this place existed long before the story started and will continue existing long after it ends. The opening narration does a lot of heavy lifting without feeling like an information dump. We learn about vibranium, the rare metal that transformed Wakanda into the most technologically advanced nation in the world. More importantly, we learn that Wakanda chose secrecy over exposure. Instead of sharing its wealth and knowledge, it hid itself from the outside world and allowed others to believe it was a poor and unimportant nation. What I found interesting is that the movie immediately presents that decision is complicated rather than obviously right or wrong. On one hand, secrecy protected Wakanda. On the other hand, it created questions that the film will continue exploring throughout the story. As we move into the present, T'Challa is preparing to become king following the death of his father. If you've seen Captain America: Civil War, you already know some of the circumstances surrounding that loss. But Black Panther wisely avoids relying too heavily on previous films. Even someone unfamiliar with the larger Marvel universe can understand the emotional situation immediately. T'Challa isn't just inheriting a throne. He's inheriting expectations. Everyone around him has ideas about what kind of king he should be. Some expect him to continue tradition. Others hope he'll bring change. And the pressure of those expectations becomes one of the movie's most important themes. Chadwick Boseman deserves a lot of credit because he immediately makes T'Challa feel believable as both a warrior and a future ruler. A lot of superhero movies focus almost entirely on physical strength, but Boseman approaches the character differently. Even during action scenes, there's always a sense that T'Challa is thinking about responsibility. His decisions rarely feel impulsive. He carries himself like someone aware that every action reflects not only on him but on an entire nation. One thing I appreciated while watching these early scenes was how confident Ryan Coogler's direction feels. The movie doesn't rush to get to explosions or major battles. Instead, it spends time allowing the audience to understand the world and the people living in it. That's a risky decision for a blockbuster because world building can easily become boring if handled poorly. Here, it remains engaging because the details feel connected to the characters. The first glimpse of Wakanda itself is genuinely impressive. Even years later, the visual design remains one of the strongest aspects of the film. The city feels futuristic without losing its cultural identity. That's a difficult balance to achieve. Many science fiction cities end up looking cold and sterile. Wakanda feels vibrant, populated, and alive. Production designer Hannah Beachler deserves enormous recognition here. The visual identity of Wakanda became one of the movie's defining achievements. Every building, vehicle, costume, and piece of technology feels connected to the same creative vision. Nothing appears random. The film also introduces several important supporting characters during these opening sections. Okoye immediately stands out as one of the most memorable. Played by Danai Gurira, she commands attention almost instantly. What I like about the character is that her loyalty is directed toward Wakanda itself rather than any individual person. That distinction becomes important later because it influences many of her decisions. Lupita Nyong'o's Nakia also makes a strong first impression. Unlike some characters who exist primarily to support the hero, Nakia feels like she has her own goals and beliefs. She cares deeply about helping people and often challenges traditional thinking. The movie benefits from having characters who are willing to question established systems rather than simply defend them. The action during these early scenes is entertaining, but what really caught my attention was how much personality the movie manages to inject into every interaction. Conversations reveal character. Relationships feel genuine. People disagree with each other in believable ways. Those details help make Wakanda feel like a real place rather than a backdrop for superhero action. Another thing worth mentioning is Ludwig Göransson's music. From the very beginning, the soundtrack helps establish the movie's identity. Many Marvel films have enjoyable scores, but Black Panther's music feels uniquely tied to its world. The soundtrack doesn't simply support scenes. It becomes part of the atmosphere. One production fact I always find fascinating is that Ryan Coogler pushed hard to make Wakanda feel culturally authentic despite being fictional. The costumes, architecture, language influences, and artistic choices were all developed with extraordinary attention to detail. Watching the movie, that effort is obvious. The world feels specific rather than generic. As T'Challa moves closer to officially becoming king, the weight of the role becomes increasingly clear. This isn't a story about someone chasing power. It's about someone inheriting power and trying to determine what should be done with it. That's an important difference because it immediately makes the character more interesting. What kept me engaged throughout these opening sections wasn't the promise of future battles or villain confrontations. It was the question of what kind of leader T'Challa would become. The movie spends a lot of time establishing that leadership isn't simply about strength. It's about judgment, responsibility, and the willingness to make difficult decisions. By the end of these opening moments, Black Panther has already established several of its greatest strengths. It has a compelling lead character, one of the most impressive fictional worlds in modern blockbuster cinema, a strong supporting cast, and themes that feel larger than the typical superhero formula. The action is exciting, but it's the people and ideas behind the action that really grab your attention. As T'Challa moves closer to officially taking the throne, the movie continues doing something I really appreciate. Instead of treating kingship like a reward, it treats it like a burden. Most superhero movies focus on characters gaining power. Black Panther focuses on what happens after someone already has it. That difference gives the story a unique perspective because T'Challa isn't trying to become important. He's trying to prove he's worthy of responsibilities he never asked for. One of the things that stood out to me during these scenes is how much tradition matters in Wakanda. Every ceremony, every ritual, and every decision feels connected to generations of history. The movie spends time showing that leadership isn't simply about what T'Challa wants. It's about respecting customs that existed long before he was born. The coronation sequence remains one of my favorite parts of the film. Even after multiple viewings, it's difficult not to be impressed by the visual presentation. The costumes alone are incredible. Every tribe has a distinct appearance, and yet everything still feels connected to the larger identity of Wakanda. This is one of those moments where you can really see the amount of research and creativity that went into the production. Ruthie Carter's costume design deserves every bit of praise it received. Superhero movies often focus on creating one memorable suit for the main character, but Black Panther builds an entire visual culture. Every costume communicates something about the people wearing it. Their status, tribe, traditions, and personality all become visible through design choices. What I like most about the coronation scene is that it doesn't just look impressive. It also reveals important information about the society. We see how different tribes interact with one another. We see who supports T'Challa and who remains skeptical. Most importantly, we see that becoming king isn't automatic. The challenge ritual is a perfect example of how the movie combines action with storytelling. The fight itself is exciting, but the real purpose of the scene is to demonstrate how Wakanda's leadership system works. T'Challa must earn his position publicly. His claim to the throne isn't protected by technology or political influence. It depends entirely on whether he can prove himself. Chadwick Boseman continues impressing me during these moments because he never plays T'Challa as someone obsessed with victory. Even in combat, he feels respectful. There is confidence in the character, but there is also humility. That's not always easy to portray in a superhero movie where protagonists are often encouraged to appear larger than life. The action choreography during the challenge sequence is also worth mentioning. Unlike many blockbuster fights that rely heavily on editing, this scene allows the audience to appreciate the physical performance. You can follow what's happening. Every strike feels meaningful because the movie understands that clarity is often more important than speed. Another character who continues standing out is Shuri, played by Letitia Wright. Every time she appears on screen, the energy changes. Shuri could have easily become the typical comic relief genius character, but the movie gives her much more personality than that. She's intelligent, funny, confident, and genuinely important to the story. One thing I appreciate about Shuri is that her intelligence never feels like a gimmick. She's responsible for many of Wakanda's technological innovations, but the movie doesn't constantly stop to remind the audience how smart she is. Instead, it simply allows her actions to demonstrate it. The relationship between T'Challa and Shuri is also one of the strongest in the film. Their interactions feel natural, like actual siblings rather than characters created to serve specific plot functions. Small moments between them help humanize both characters. Ryan Coogler's direction continues shining throughout these scenes. What impresses me most is how comfortable he seems balancing multiple tones. The movie can move from serious political discussions to humor and then back to emotional moments without feeling inconsistent. That's a difficult thing to accomplish because tonal shifts often create problems in large franchise films. The soundtrack continues playing a huge role as well. Ludwig Göransson's score helps every major moment feel distinct. Whether the scene focuses on tradition, action, or emotion, the music consistently reinforces the atmosphere. It's one of those scores that becomes more impressive the more attention you pay to it. A fascinating production fact is that Göransson traveled and worked with musicians to help develop the unique sound of Wakanda. That effort is noticeable because the music never feels generic. It feels connected to the world in the same way the costumes and architecture do. As T'Challa officially becomes king, another important theme starts becoming more visible. Everyone around him has advice. Everyone has opinions. Everyone believes they know what's best for Wakanda. Yet ultimately, T'Challa will be the one making decisions. That's a lonely position, and the movie understands that leadership often comes with isolation. Nakia continues serving as one of the voices encouraging change. She believes Wakanda has a responsibility to do more for people beyond its borders. T'Challa understands her perspective, but he also understands the fears that have shaped Wakanda's policies for generations. That disagreement is interesting because neither side feels unreasonable. What I really admire about the movie is that it doesn't rush these discussions. Many superhero films are eager to get to the next battle. Black Panther is willing to spend time exploring ideas. The action matters, but the questions behind the action matter too. T'Challa officially holds the title of king, but it already feels clear that becoming king was the easy part. The difficult challenge will be deciding what kind of king he wants to be. Tradition has given him a path to follow, but several people around him are already encouraging him to think differently. That tension between preserving the past and embracing change is becoming increasingly important, and it's one of the reasons the movie remains so engaging. The story isn't simply about protecting Wakanda. It's about defining Wakanda's future. And the more the film explores that idea, the more interesting it becomes. Now that T'Challa has officially become king, the movie begins shifting its attention toward the challenges waiting outside the ceremonial traditions. What I found interesting here is that Black Panther never allows T'Challa to enjoy his victory for very long. The crown may now be his, but the responsibilities attached to it are only beginning. Almost immediately, he's forced to start dealing with problems that previous rulers either ignored or managed to keep hidden. One of the reasons this part of the movie works so well is because it starts expanding the world beyond Wakanda's borders. Up until now, most of the focus has been on internal traditions, leadership, and family. Now the story begins exploring how Wakanda interacts with the rest of the world, and that shift becomes incredibly important for everything that follows. Nakia continues playing a major role during these scenes. What I like about her character is that she constantly challenges comfortable assumptions. While many people in Wakanda are satisfied with isolation, Nakia sees suffering in other parts of the world and believes her nation has the resources to help. She isn't arguing from a position of rebellion. She genuinely believes Wakanda can make a difference. The movie wisely avoids presenting her viewpoint as obviously correct or obviously wrong. Instead, it allows the audience to understand why different people hold different opinions. That's one of the strongest aspects of Ryan Coogler's screenplay. Complex issues are rarely reduced to simple answers. As T'Challa begins addressing problems inherited from previous generations, another important character starts becoming more relevant, Ulysses Klaue. Played by Andy Serkis, Klaue brings a completely different energy to the movie. While most Wakandan characters are thoughtful, disciplined, and focused, Klaue feels unpredictable. Every time he appears, there's a sense that something chaotic is about to happen. Andy Serkis clearly enjoys the role, and that enthusiasm comes through in his performance. Klaue could have easily become a forgettable secondary villain, but Serkis gives him enough personality to make him memorable. He feels dangerous not because he's physically stronger than everyone else, but because he's reckless and willing to do things other people wouldn't consider. What makes Klaue particularly important is his connection to Wakanda's past. He isn't just another criminal. He's someone whose actions left scars that are still affecting people years later. The movie uses him as a reminder that even a hidden nation cannot completely escape the consequences of events happening beyond its borders. The action begins increasing during these sections, and one thing I noticed is how confidently the film handles location changes. We move away from Wakanda for a while, yet the story never loses momentum. Instead, these new environments help emphasize how different the outside world feels compared to the carefully controlled society T'Challa comes from. Another character who continues impressing me is Okoye. Danai Gurira delivers one of the strongest performances in the film, and much of that comes from how committed the character is to her principles. Okoye's loyalty is to Wakanda above everything else. That sounds simple, but the movie repeatedly places her in situations where that loyalty becomes complicated. One thing I appreciate is that Okoye isn't written as a bodyguard who simply agrees with every decision. She has opinions. She has convictions. And while she respects authority, she also has a strong sense of duty that guides her actions. The relationship between T'Challa and Okoye is particularly interesting because it reflects different approaches to leadership. T'Challa is still learning what kind of king he wants to become. Okoye already knows exactly where her loyalties belong. That contrast creates some great interactions throughout the movie. Visually, the film continues looking incredible. Even when the story leaves Wakanda, Ryan Coogler and cinematographer Rachel Morrison maintain a strong visual identity. Morrison deserves enormous credit because she constantly finds ways to make scenes feel both intimate and cinematic at the same time. A production fact worth mentioning is that Rachel Morrison became the first woman ever nominated for an Academy Award for Best Cinematography. Watching Black Panther, it's easy to understand why her work received so much recognition. The movie consistently looks beautiful without ever feeling distracted by its own visuals. Shuri also continues stealing scenes whenever she appears. What I enjoy about her character is that she brings humor into the story without undermining its seriousness. Some movies struggle with balancing comedy and drama. Black Panther generally handles that balance very well, and Shuri plays a huge role in making that possible. The technology she creates remains fascinating because it reflects the larger identity of Wakanda. Nothing feels copied from other science fiction movies. The gadgets, vehicles, and tools all seem like natural extensions of the world's culture. That's something many fictional universes struggle to achieve. As the search for Kaluuya becomes more important, T'Challa starts facing situations that test him in ways ceremonial combat never could. Fighting for a throne is straightforward compared to dealing with real-world consequences. Here, leadership requires judgment rather than strength. That's another reason Chadwick Boseman's performance works so well. He never treats T'Challa as someone who believes he has all the answers. The character listens. He observes. He questions himself. Those qualities make him feel like a genuine leader rather than simply a powerful superhero. The movie also starts hinting at deeper issues beneath the surface. There are suggestions that Wakanda's past may contain secrets. Certain conversations feel loaded with meaning even before the audience fully understands why. Those hints create curiosity because you can sense larger revelations waiting ahead. What kept me engaged during these scenes wasn't simply the mission to capture Kaluuya. It was the feeling that T'Challa was slowly discovering how complicated leadership actually is. Every decision affects multiple people. Every action creates consequences. And every answer seems to lead to another question. Black Panther feels larger than ever. The world is expanding, the stakes are increasing, and T'Challa's responsibilities are becoming more complicated. The movie is no longer just about a new king taking the throne. It's becoming a story about what happens when a leader starts questioning the systems and assumptions that shaped the world he inherited. As the search for Kaluuya continues, one thing that really stood out to me was how naturally the movie transitions from a story about leadership into a story about consequences. Up until now, T'Challa has been dealing with responsibilities that came with becoming king. Now he's beginning to deal with the consequences of decisions made long before he was born. That's where Black Panther becomes much more interesting than a standard superhero film. The mission eventually leads T'Challa, Nakia, and Okoye into unfamiliar territory, and I love how these scenes allow the audience to see the characters operating outside the comfort of Wakanda. Inside their homeland, they understand the rules, the culture, and the expectations. Outside of it, they're forced to adapt. Watching those adjustments creates some of the movie's most entertaining moments. What I especially enjoyed was the chemistry between the main cast. Chadwick Boseman, Lupita Nyong'o, Danai Gurira, and Letitia Wright all bring something different to the story. Their interactions feel natural rather than scripted. You get the sense that these people genuinely know each other, and that authenticity helps make the relationships believable. Nakia continues to be one of the most important voices in the movie. The more time we spend with her, the clearer it becomes that she's constantly encouraging T'Challa to see a bigger picture. While many people are focused on protecting Wakanda, Nakia is thinking about how Wakanda's resources could help others. The movie doesn't force viewers to agree with her, but it consistently treats her perspective with respect. Another thing I appreciated was how much personality Ryan Coogler allows each character to have. In some superhero movies, supporting characters exist mainly to provide information or assist during action scenes. Here, everyone feels like they have their own beliefs and motivations. Even when characters disagree, those disagreements feel meaningful because they come from genuine convictions. The confrontation involving Kaluuya is also where the movie starts reminding us that Wakanda's secrets aren't as secure as many people would like to believe. Kaluuya knows things. He's seen things. And his existence alone challenges the image Wakanda has carefully maintained for generations. Andy Serkis continues having a great time with the role. Every scene involving Kaluuya feels unpredictable because he operates according to his own rules. While other characters carefully consider consequences, Kaluuya often seems driven by greed, ego, and excitement. That recklessness makes him dangerous because he's willing to take risks that more rational people would avoid. The action sequences during these scenes are some of the strongest in the movie. What I really liked was how each character contributes differently. T'Challa relies on skill and discipline. Okoye brings precision and confidence. Nakia approaches situations from her own perspective. Nobody feels interchangeable, which helps the action feel more dynamic. Ryan Coogler deserves credit for making these sequences easy to follow. Modern action movies sometimes become so obsessed with speed that viewers lose track of what's happening. Black Panther generally avoids that problem. The audience understands where characters are, what they're trying to accomplish, and why it matters. Visually, the movie continues impressing me. Rachel Morrison's cinematography gives even relatively small moments a sense of importance. There are scenes where characters are simply talking, yet the framing and composition keep everything engaging. That's often the sign of strong filmmaking. Spectacle is important, but visual storytelling matters just as much. Another production detail that deserves recognition is the film's commitment to creating a distinct identity. Many superhero movies share a similar visual language. Black Panther consistently feels different. The costumes, architecture, technology, and color palette all work together to create something instantly recognizable. Shuri remains one of the most enjoyable parts of the movie. What I appreciate about her is that she never feels like she's trying to steal scenes. She's naturally charismatic. Her intelligence is impressive, but her humor and confidence are what make her memorable. The relationship she shares with T'Challa continues adding warmth to the story. As events continue unfolding, T'Challa starts learning things that challenge his understanding of the world. That's a crucial development because heroes often grow strongest when they're forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Physical challenges are important, but intellectual and emotional challenges are often far more interesting. One thing I noticed during these scenes is that the movie keeps asking questions without rushing to provide answers. Was Wakanda right to remain hidden? Could things have been handled differently? What responsibilities come with extraordinary power? These questions remain present in the background even during action-heavy moments. Ludwig Göransson's score continues doing fantastic work as well. Every major scene feels elevated by the music. The soundtrack doesn't simply support the action. It strengthens the identity of the entire film. Even years later, many of the musical themes remain instantly recognizable. A fascinating production fact is that the filmmakers spent a huge amount of time ensuring Wakanda felt technologically advanced without losing its connection to tradition. That's one of the movie's greatest achievements. The future and the past exist side by side in a way that feels believable within the world. As the mission develops, T'Challa begins realizing that leadership requires more than protecting what already exists. Sometimes it requires questioning whether existing systems are actually working. That's a difficult realization because it means examining traditions that people have trusted for generations. What makes Chadwick Boseman's performance so effective is that he handles these moments with subtlety. T'Challa doesn't suddenly become rebellious or dramatic. Instead, you can see him thinking. You can see him processing new information and reconsidering assumptions. That quiet internal struggle becomes one of the movie's strongest elements. The story feels like it's building towards something much larger than the hunt for Kaluuya. The action remains exciting, but the real tension is coming from the questions surrounding Wakanda itself. Secrets are beginning to surface. Old decisions are starting to have consequences. And Chala is slowly discovering that being king may require him to challenge ideas that previous generations accepted without question. I think this is where Black Panther really starts separating itself from many other superhero movies. Up until now, the film has done an excellent job introducing Wakanda, establishing Chala's responsibilities, and creating tension around its secrets. But now the story begins digging deeper into the consequences of those secrets, and that's where things become much more compelling. One thing I noticed while watching these scenes is that Chala is constantly caught between two different versions of leadership. One version tells him to preserve what already exists. The other encourages him to ask difficult questions about whether the existing system is actually fair. Neither option feels easy, and that's exactly what makes the conflict interesting. The movie wisely avoids presenting Chala as someone who immediately knows what to do. A less interesting story would have given him all the answers from the beginning. Instead, he's learning as he goes. Every new revelation forces him to reconsider things he previously accepted as truth. The fallout from the mission involving Kaluuya becomes increasingly important because it starts exposing fractures beneath Wakanda's polished surface. From the outside, Wakanda appears united, powerful, and stable. The deeper we get into the story, the more we realize that every nation, no matter how advanced, carries unresolved issues from its past. What I appreciate most is that these issues aren't introduced artificially. The movie has been planting seeds from the very beginning. Conversations that seemed simple earlier now carry greater significance. Small details suddenly feel more important. That's usually a sign of strong storytelling because it rewards viewers for paying attention. Chadwick Boseman continues delivering a performance built on quiet strength. One of the reasons Chala works so well as a protagonist is that he listens. He spends much of the movie absorbing information from people around him. Some leaders assume they already know everything. Chala's willingness to learn becomes one of his greatest strengths. Another character who continues impressing me is Okoye. Danai Gurira brings so much authority to every scene that it's impossible to ignore her presence. What makes Okoye fascinating is that her loyalty is unwavering, yet that loyalty is directed toward Wakanda itself rather than any individual ruler. As events become more complicated, that distinction grows increasingly important. The movie also continues giving Nakia meaningful things to do. She's not simply following the hero around waiting for the next action sequence. Her perspective actively shapes Chala's thinking. Some of the most important ideas in the movie are introduced through conversations with her, and Lupita Nyong'o handles those moments beautifully. Visually, the film remains stunning. Even after spending significant time in Wakanda, the world never stops feeling impressive. Every location appears thoughtfully designed. Every environment feels connected to the larger culture. That's one of the biggest reasons Wakanda became so memorable. It doesn't feel like a movie set. It feels like a place. Production designer Hannah Beachler deserves another mention because the amount of detail throughout the film is remarkable. From royal chambers to laboratories to tribal gathering places, everything contributes to the sense that Wakanda has centuries of history behind it. The action also continues improving because the audience now understands the characters more deeply. Action scenes are always more effective when viewers care about the people involved. Early in the movie, the fights were entertaining because they looked impressive. Now they're engaging because the outcomes have emotional significance. Ryan Coogler's direction remains one of the movie's greatest strengths. What impresses me most is his confidence. He isn't rushing through scenes simply to get to the next explosion. He's willing to spend time on conversations, disagreements, and character development. That patience allows the emotional moments to carry more weight. Another thing I found interesting is how the movie keeps returning to the idea of inherited responsibility. Chala isn't only dealing with his own choices. He's dealing with decisions made by previous generations. That's a heavy burden because it forces him to ask whether loyalty to tradition should outweigh the need for change. Those questions become increasingly important as more information begins coming to light. Certain truths that were hidden for years are starting to surface, and the impact of those truths reaches far beyond individual characters. Entire assumptions about Wakanda's history are being challenged. The score by Ludwig Göransson continues elevating every major scene. There are moments where the music alone adds tremendous emotional weight. The soundtrack understands exactly when to become powerful and when to step back. That's one of the reasons it remains one of the most memorable scores in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A production fact that always stands out to me is how much collaboration went into creating Wakanda's identity. The filmmakers worked extensively to ensure that the world felt unique, coherent, and culturally rich. Watching the movie, you can see the results of that effort everywhere. As the story progresses, another theme starts becoming clearer. Power doesn't automatically make people wise. Wakanda possesses extraordinary technology and resources, yet that doesn't mean every decision it made was correct. The movie consistently challenges the assumption that success equals moral certainty. What kept me engaged throughout these scenes was the growing realization that the biggest threat facing Wakanda might not come from outside its borders. It might come from questions that have been ignored for too long. That's a much more interesting conflict than a simple battle between heroes and villains because it forces characters to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their history. The supporting cast continues contributing to that complexity. Every major character seems to represent a different viewpoint about what Wakanda should be. Some value stability. Some value progress. Some prioritize tradition. Others prioritize responsibility beyond national borders. None of those perspectives feel entirely unreasonable, which makes the discussions more engaging. The deeper the movie gets, the more I started appreciating how carefully it builds its central conflict. A lot of superhero films introduce a villain and immediately tell the audience who the bad guy is. Black Panther takes a different approach. It spends time exploring why certain people think the way they do, and because of that, the conflict feels much more layered than a simple fight between good and evil. One thing that really stood out to me during these scenes is how much T'Challa's confidence starts getting tested. Earlier in the movie, he was dealing with responsibilities he expected to inherit. Now he's dealing with information he never expected to discover. That's a much harder challenge because it forces him to question things he once accepted without hesitation. The movie continues revealing pieces of Wakanda's history, and with every new detail, the situation becomes more complicated. What I admire is that the film doesn't treat history as something distant and irrelevant. Instead, it shows how decisions made years ago can continue affecting people long after those who made them are gone. Chadwick Boseman handles this shift in the story extremely well. Up until now, T'Challa has largely been reacting to external challenges. Here, the struggle becomes more personal. He's no longer just defending Wakanda. He's trying to understand it. That's an important difference because understanding something often requires confronting uncomfortable truths. What makes Boseman's performance so effective is that he never overplays those moments. T'Challa isn't constantly announcing his doubts or explaining his feelings. Instead, much of the character's growth happens through observation and reflection. You can often see him processing information before he speaks, which makes his decisions feel thoughtful. Another character who continues impressing me is Shuri. The movie could have easily used her as nothing more than a source of technology and comic relief, but she ends up being much more than that. Shuri represents the future of Wakanda in many ways. She's proud of her culture, yet she's constantly pushing boundaries and looking for new possibilities. Letitia Wright brings so much energy to the role that every scene involving Shuri feels alive. Whether she's joking with T'Challa or discussing serious issues, she never feels out of place. That's a difficult balance to maintain, especially in a movie dealing with heavy themes. The visual design continues being one of the film's greatest strengths. Every time the camera moves through Wakanda, there's something new to notice. The architecture, transportation systems, clothing, and technology all feel connected to a shared vision. That's why the world remains memorable long after the credits roll. Rachel Morrison's cinematography deserves enormous praise here. One thing I noticed is how often the movie uses wide shots to emphasize the scale of Wakanda while also using close-ups to keep the audience emotionally connected to the characters. The balance between those two approaches helps the film feel both epic and personal. As more information comes to light, T'Challa begins realizing that leadership sometimes means confronting mistakes made by people you respect. That's not an easy position to be in. It's one thing to challenge an enemy. It's another thing entirely to challenge traditions and decisions connected to your own family. The movie handles that tension beautifully because it doesn't offer easy answers. T'Challa respects the people who came before him. He understands why certain choices were made. At the same time, he's beginning to wonder whether those choices created problems that can no longer be ignored. Nakia continues serving as an important influence during these scenes. One thing I appreciate about her character is that she never stops advocating for her beliefs. Even when others disagree with her, she remains committed to the idea that Wakanda should play a larger role in helping people beyond its borders. The relationship between Nakia and T'Challa works particularly well because it isn't built solely around romance. They genuinely challenge each other intellectually. Their conversations often push the story forward because they represent different ways of looking at the world. Okoye remains equally compelling. Danai Gurira brings such conviction to the role that even simple lines carry weight. What makes Okoye fascinating is that she's constantly balancing loyalty, duty, and personal belief. Those priorities don't always align perfectly, and the movie understands that conflict. The score continues doing incredible work as well. Ludwig Göransson created music that feels completely tied to the identity of Wakanda. There are scenes where the visuals are already impressive, yet the music somehow makes them feel even larger. That's often the sign of a truly great soundtrack. A production fact worth mentioning is that Black Panther became one of the few superhero films ever nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. Watching the movie, it's easy to understand why. The film isn't simply trying to entertain. It's also trying to explore meaningful ideas through its characters and story. As the narrative continues unfolding, the theme of identity becomes increasingly important. T'Challa isn't just asking what kind of king he wants to be. He's asking what kind of nation Wakanda wants to become. Those questions are connected because leaders inevitably shape the future of the places they govern. What kept me engaged during these scenes was the feeling that the story was building towards something much bigger than a traditional superhero climax. The action remains exciting, but the emotional and philosophical questions are becoming just as important. That's a difficult balance to achieve, and Black Panther handles it remarkably well. The supporting cast continues strengthening every scene they're in. Nobody feels wasted. Everyone contributes something meaningful, whether it's a perspective, a challenge, or an emotional connection. That's one of the advantages of having such a strong ensemble. The world feels richer because every major character matters. It becomes clear that T'Challa's greatest challenge may not be defeating an enemy. It may be deciding how to respond to truths that have changed the way he sees his family, his country, and himself. The more he learns, the harder it becomes to simply follow the path laid out by previous generations. And that's exactly what makes this part of the movie so compelling. The story is no longer just about protecting Wakanda. It's becoming a story about redefining what Wakanda stands for and determining whether the future should look different from the past. One of the things I kept thinking about while watching this part of the movie was how much T'Challa's understanding of Wakanda is changing. Earlier, he viewed many traditions as permanent truths. Now he's starting to see them as decisions made by people, and like all decisions, they can be questioned. That shift is incredibly important because it marks the moment where T'Challa begins thinking like more than just a king. He starts thinking like a leader who understands that preserving something and improving something are not always the same thing. What I really appreciate is that the movie never turns this into a simple rebellion against tradition. T'Challa still respects the history of Wakanda. He still values the people who came before him. The conflict comes from realizing that honoring the past doesn't necessarily mean repeating every choice that was made in the past. That's a mature idea for a superhero movie to explore, and it's one of the reasons Black Panther continues feeling relevant years after its release. As more information starts surfacing, the emotional weight of the story becomes much heavier. Earlier, many of the challenges felt external. There were criminals to stop, missions to complete, and threats to address. Now the story is becoming deeply personal. Certain truths are forcing T'Challa to reevaluate things he believed about his family and his nation's history. Chadwick Boseman handles these moments beautifully. One thing that made him such a compelling actor is that he never felt the need to over-explain emotions. A lot of the time, you can understand exactly what T'Challa is feeling just by watching him listen to someone else speak. There is a quiet intensity in his performance that makes even small moments feel significant. The supporting cast continues elevating every scene they're in. Danai Gurira remains outstanding as Okoye. What makes her character so interesting is that her sense of duty never feels artificial. She genuinely believes in serving Wakanda above all else, and that conviction influences every decision she makes. Even when viewers might disagree with her choices, they understand why she's making them. Lupita Nyong'o's Nakia continues representing a different perspective. She sees opportunities where others see risks. Throughout the movie, she keeps returning to the idea that Wakanda's resources could change countless lives if they were shared more openly. What I like is that the film never presents her as naive. She understands the dangers involved. She simply believes those dangers shouldn't prevent action. The conversations between Nakia and T'Challa are some of my favorite parts of the movie because they often reveal more about the central themes than the action scenes do. They aren't arguing because they dislike each other. They're discussing fundamentally different ideas about responsibility. Those discussions help make the story feel larger than a typical superhero adventure. Visually, the movie continues looking incredible. Wakanda remains one of the most fully realized fictional settings in modern blockbuster cinema. Every location feels connected to the culture and history of the people who live there. Whether we're seeing royal chambers, technological facilities, marketplaces, or tribal gathering places, everything feels like part of the same world. A huge amount of credit belongs to production designer Hannah Beachler and the entire creative team. Building a fictional nation is difficult. Building one that audiences remember years later is even harder. Wakanda feels authentic because every creative decision supports the larger vision. Another character who continues standing out is Shuri. What I enjoy most about her is that she's never intimidated by status. Whether she's speaking to T'Challa, questioning traditions, or presenting new technology, she carries herself with complete confidence. Letitia Wright brings an energy to the role that helps balance some of the heavier themes elsewhere in the movie. The technological side of Wakanda remains fascinating because it never feels disconnected from the culture. In many science fiction stories, technology replaces identity. Here, technology grows out of identity. The inventions, vehicles, and tools all feel like natural extensions of the society that created them. Ryan Coogler's direction continues impressing me because he understands when to slow down. Many blockbusters become afraid of quiet moments. They rush from one major event to another because they're worried audiences might lose interest. Black Panther trusts viewers enough to spend time on conversations, relationships, and ideas. That confidence pays off because the emotional stakes keep getting stronger. The more time we spend with these characters, the more invested we become in the decisions they're making. Action scenes are exciting, but they matter more when they're connected to people we care about. Ludwig Göransson's score continues doing phenomenal work throughout these scenes. The music often creates emotion before characters even speak. There are moments where the soundtrack alone communicates a sense of history, pride, uncertainty, or loss. That's one of the reasons the score became so celebrated after the movie's release. A fascinating production fact is that Black Panther became a cultural phenomenon almost immediately after release. It wasn't simply successful financially. People connected with the world, characters, and themes in a way that extended far beyond the usual superhero audience. Watching the movie today, it's easy to understand why. The story is operating on multiple levels at once. The theme of legacy becomes increasingly important as events continue unfolding. T'Challa inherited more than a throne. He inherited decisions, responsibilities, and consequences. Some of those things are sources of pride. Others are much more complicated. The movie constantly asks what people owe to the generations that came before them and whether loyalty should ever prevent necessary change. What keeps everything engaging is that no character has a perfect answer. Nakia sees one side of the issue. Okoye sees another. T'Challa is trying to find a path between competing viewpoints. Even characters who only appear briefly often contribute ideas that challenge assumptions. The story keeps pushing T'Challa toward difficult questions, and every answer seems to create another question behind it. The world he inherited is more complicated than he realized. The traditions he respected contain both wisdom and flaws. The future he's responsible for creating may require choices that previous leaders were unwilling to make. As the movie keeps unfolding, the emotional center of the story starts becoming much clearer. What initially looked like a story about protecting Wakanda is gradually turning into a story about understanding Wakanda. That's an important difference because protecting something is often easier than questioning it. T'Challa is discovering that leadership isn't just about defending what already exists. Sometimes it means confronting truths that make people uncomfortable. One thing I really admire about the screenplay is how patient it is. The movie doesn't rush major revelations. Instead, it allows information to surface gradually, giving both the audience and the characters time to process it. That approach makes the emotional impact much stronger because every discovery feels earned rather than manufactured. Chadwick Boseman continues carrying the film with a remarkable sense of calm authority. What's fascinating about T'Challa is that his strength rarely comes from aggression. Even when he's facing difficult situations, he usually responds with thoughtfulness before action. That's not a common trait among blockbuster heroes, and it's one of the reasons the character feels so memorable. The more I watch these scenes, the more I appreciate how much responsibility weighs on him. Every decision he makes affects millions of people. Every choice has consequences beyond his own life. The movie constantly reminds us of that pressure without needing lengthy speeches about it. Another thing that stands out is how well the supporting cast complements T'Challa. Every major character seems to represent a different way of looking at Wakanda's future. Nakia believes the nation should become more involved with the outside world. Okoye prioritizes stability and duty. Shuri represents innovation and progress. Together, they create a range of perspectives that constantly challenge T'Challa's thinking. Danai Gurira continues being incredible as Okoye. There are moments where she communicates more through a single expression than some characters communicate through entire scenes. Her loyalty is never in question, but the movie repeatedly places her in situations where loyalty becomes complicated. That's what makes her such a compelling character. Lupita Nyong'o remains equally impressive. Nakia isn't simply offering a different opinion. She's challenging the foundation of policies that have existed for generations. What I like is that she never comes across as someone trying to create conflict. She genuinely wants Wakanda to use its resources to improve lives beyond its borders. The relationship between these characters feels authentic because their disagreements come from values rather than personal hostility. They care about each other. They simply see the world differently. That's a much more interesting source of tension than misunderstandings or forced drama. Visually, the movie continues operating at an incredibly high level. Wakanda remains one of the most detailed fictional settings ever created for a superhero film. Every time the camera explores a new location, there are small details that make the world feel lived in. The city doesn't feel like something designed only for the story. It feels like a place where people actually live their lives. Rachel Morrison's cinematography deserves another mention because of how effectively it balances scale and intimacy. Some scenes emphasize the grandeur of Wakanda, while others focus entirely on character emotions. The transitions between those approaches feel seamless. The technology also remains fascinating. One thing I appreciate is that the movie doesn't constantly stop to explain how everything works. The filmmakers trust the audience to accept that Wakanda is technologically advanced and move forward. That confidence helps maintain the pace of the story. Shuri continues stealing scenes whenever she appears. Her intelligence is obvious, but what makes her memorable is her personality. She brings humor, curiosity, and energy into situations that might otherwise become too serious. Letitia Wright understood exactly what the role needed and delivered it consistently. Ryan Coogler's direction remains one of the film's greatest strengths. He understands that spectacle means very little without emotional investment. That's why so much attention is given to character relationships. The action is exciting because the people involved matter. Ludwig Göransson's score continues elevating everything. There are moments where the music creates a sense of history and emotion that dialogue alone couldn't achieve. It's one of those rare soundtracks that feels inseparable from the identity of the film itself. A production fact I always find impressive is how much effort went into ensuring every tribe in Wakanda had a distinct visual identity. Their clothing, customs, colors, and traditions all help create the feeling that Wakanda is made up of different communities rather than one uniform society. Those details add tremendous depth to the world. As more truths begin coming to light, the movie starts asking increasingly difficult questions. What happens when respected leaders make mistakes? How should future generations respond to those mistakes? Is preserving tradition always the right choice? These are complicated issues, and the film treats them with surprising maturity. What kept me completely engaged during these scenes was the feeling that T'Challa was slowly changing. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in a believable one. Every conversation, every discovery, and every challenge is influencing how he sees himself and his responsibilities. That's exactly how character growth should feel. The story also benefits from the fact that nobody seems entirely comfortable anymore. Earlier, many characters were confident in their positions. Now uncertainty is beginning to spread. Long-held assumptions are being challenged. Questions that were once ignored are becoming impossible to avoid. That growing uncertainty creates tension even in scenes without action. The audience can sense that important changes are coming. The world of Wakanda still looks strong and stable from the outside, but underneath the surface, powerful ideas are colliding. And that's what makes this section of the movie so compelling. The action, visuals, and technology remain impressive, but the real excitement comes from watching people wrestle with questions that don't have easy answers. T'Challa is trying to understand what kind of king he should be, and the more he learns, the more complicated that question becomes. At this stage of the movie, one of the things I appreciated most was how the conflict continued growing without losing its emotional focus. A lot of blockbuster films reach a point where everything becomes bigger, louder, and more explosive, but the characters start feeling less important. Black Panther avoids that problem because every major development is tied directly to the people involved. No matter how large the stakes become, the story keeps returning to personal choices and personal consequences. What really stood out to me was how much pressure T'Challa is under. Earlier, he was trying to live up to the expectations placed on him by his father and by Wakanda. Now he's beginning to realize that some of those expectations may have been built on incomplete truths. That's a difficult realization for anyone, especially for someone whose entire identity has been shaped by respect for tradition. Chadwick Boseman continues delivering a performance that feels incredibly natural. One thing that made him so effective in this role is that he never needed to force authority. T'Challa commands respect because of how he behaves, not because the movie constantly tells us he's important. Even during scenes where he's uncertain, he still feels like someone people would willingly follow. The emotional weight of the story keeps increasing because the questions surrounding Wakanda are becoming harder to ignore. The movie is no longer asking whether Wakanda should remain hidden. It's asking what responsibilities come with having the power to help others. That's a much more complicated discussion, and the film wisely allows different characters to approach it from different angles. Nakia remains one of the strongest voices advocating for change. What I admire about her is that she never loses sight of people. While others focus on politics, security, and tradition, Nakia often focuses on human consequences. She sees opportunities for Wakanda to improve lives beyond its borders and believes that ignoring those opportunities comes with a cost. Okoye continues representing another perspective entirely. Danai Gurira gives every line so much conviction that even when viewers disagree with her character, they understand her reasoning. Okoye believes deeply in duty, and the movie consistently explores what happens when duty and personal belief begin pulling someone in different directions. The relationship between these characters remains one of the film's greatest strengths. Their disagreements feel meaningful because everyone involved genuinely cares about Wakanda. Nobody is creating conflict for the sake of drama. They're struggling with difficult questions that don't have obvious solutions. Visually, the movie continues looking spectacular. Wakanda remains a remarkable achievement in world building. The more time we spend there, the more details become noticeable. The technology, architecture, clothing, and traditions all feel connected. That's one of the reasons audiences became so attached to this world. It feels complete. Rachel Morrison's cinematography deserves tremendous credit for helping create that feeling. Some scenes are breathtaking in scale, while others focus entirely on emotion. The movie knows when to emphasize the grandeur of Wakanda and when to focus on the people living within it. Another character who continues making every scene better is Shuri. Letitia Wright brings so much charm and confidence to the role that it's impossible not to enjoy watching her. What I appreciate is that the movie never treats intelligence as something boring. Shuri's curiosity and creativity make her one of the most entertaining characters in the entire story. Ryan Coogler continues demonstrating an impressive understanding of pacing. Even though the story is becoming more serious, the movie never feels heavy or slow. There is always movement. There is always a sense that important developments are happening. Yet at the same time, the film never rushes through emotional moments. The score by Ludwig Göransson remains phenomenal. There are scenes where the music adds an incredible sense of scale and importance. One of the reasons the soundtrack works so well is that it feels completely connected to the world of Wakanda. The music doesn't simply accompany the story. It feels like part of the story. A production fact worth mentioning is that Black Panther became one of the most critically acclaimed superhero movies ever made. It wasn't just praised for its action or visuals. Critics and audiences responded strongly to its themes, performances, and world building. Watching it today, it's easy to understand why it generated that level of discussion. As the story keeps moving forward, the idea of legacy becomes more important than ever. T'Challa inherited a kingdom, but he also inherited choices made by previous generations. Some of those choices protected Wakanda. Others created problems that are only now becoming visible. The challenge facing him is figuring out how to honor the past without becoming trapped by it. What I found fascinating is that the movie never portrays change as easy. Every possible path comes with risks. Remaining isolated has consequences. Opening up to the world has consequences. The film respects the complexity of those decisions instead of pretending there's a simple answer waiting to be discovered. The supporting cast continues contributing to that complexity. Every major character brings a perspective that feels valid from their point of view. That's one of the reasons the movie remains engaging even during scenes built entirely around conversation. The discussions matter because the ideas matter. The deeper T'Challa gets into these issues, the more obvious it becomes that strength alone isn't going to solve them. Physical power can defeat enemies, but it can't answer questions about responsibility, justice, and leadership. Those questions require wisdom, and wisdom is something Chala is still developing. The tension continues building because it feels like multiple forces are moving toward a collision. Long-standing traditions are being questioned. Hidden truths are becoming harder to hide. Different visions for Wakanda's future are beginning to clash. Everyone involved believes they're acting in the nation's best interest, but their definitions of what that means are becoming increasingly different. What makes this stretch of the movie so engaging is that the tension no longer comes from a single source. Earlier, there were clear objectives and clear missions. Now there are questions hanging over almost every major character. Questions about loyalty. Questions about responsibility. Questions about whether Wakanda's greatest strength has also become one of its greatest weaknesses. Chala continues finding himself pulled in multiple directions at once. He wants to respect the traditions that shaped his nation. He wants to honor the legacy of his father. At the same time, he can no longer ignore the possibility that some important decisions from the past created consequences that people are still living with today. That's one of the reasons Chadwick Boseman's performance works so well. Chala never feels like someone searching for power. If anything, he often feels like someone carrying the weight of power. Every decision matters. Every mistake matters. Every choice affects people beyond himself. Boseman communicates that pressure without needing dramatic speeches or exaggerated emotional moments. The movie also continues benefiting from the strength of its supporting cast. Nakia remains one of the most important influences in Chala's life because she constantly encourages him to look beyond what is comfortable. She isn't interested in preserving traditions simply because they exist. She wants to know whether those traditions are still serving the people they're supposed to protect. Lupita Nyong'o brings so much sincerity to the role that Nakia's arguments never feel forced. Even when other characters disagree with her, it's easy to understand why she believes what she believes. The movie treats her ideas seriously, and that makes the larger discussion about Wakanda's future feel more meaningful. Okoye continues representing another side of that discussion. Her commitment to duty remains one of the strongest forces in the story. What makes her fascinating is that she genuinely believes stability matters. She understands that rapid change can create problems just as easily as inaction can. Danai Gurira gives the character such confidence that every scene involving her carries weight. One thing I really admire about Black Panther is that it allows intelligent people to disagree with one another. Too many movies simplify complex issues by making one side obviously correct and the other obviously wrong. Here, different characters arrive at different conclusions because they prioritize different values. That makes the conflict feel far more authentic. Visually, the film continues operating at an incredibly high level. Every time the story returns to Wakanda, I find myself noticing new details. The city feels alive. The technology feels integrated into everyday life. The architecture reflects both innovation and tradition. Few fictional settings have ever felt this fully realized. The amount of work that went into creating Wakanda is honestly remarkable. Production designer Hannah Beachler and her team didn't just build locations. They built an entire identity. Everything from transportation systems to ceremonial spaces feels connected to a larger cultural vision. Shuri remains one of the movie's most enjoyable characters as well. What I appreciate is that her intelligence never creates distance between her and the audience. Sometimes genius characters can feel detached because they're operating on a completely different level from everyone else. Shuri remains relatable because of her personality. Her humor, confidence, and curiosity make her easy to connect with. Letitia Wright's performance adds a tremendous amount of energy to the film. Even during serious moments, she brings a sense of enthusiasm that helps keep the movie balanced. That's especially important because the themes are becoming increasingly heavy. Ryan Coogler deserves enormous credit for maintaining that balance. The movie is discussing leadership, history, responsibility, and identity, yet it never feels like a lecture. The ideas emerge naturally through the characters and their experiences. That's much harder to accomplish than simply having characters explain themes directly. The score by Ludwig Göransson continues elevating nearly every scene. There are moments where the music creates a sense of emotion before anyone even speaks. It's one of those soundtracks that becomes inseparable from the movie itself. When you think about Wakanda, it's difficult not to think about the music as well. A fascinating production fact is that the soundtrack and score were developed with extraordinary attention to cultural influences. Göransson spent significant time researching and collaborating with musicians to help create a sound that felt unique to Wakanda. The result is one of the most distinctive musical identities in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. The emotional side of the story keeps getting stronger because T'Challa's journey is becoming more personal. Earlier, he was focused on proving himself worthy of the throne. Now he's trying to determine what being worthy actually means. That's a much deeper challenge because there isn't a single correct answer. What I found particularly compelling during these scenes is how often the movie returns to the idea that leadership requires courage in different forms. Physical courage is important, but moral courage can be even more difficult. Standing against an enemy is one thing. Questioning assumptions that have existed your entire life is something else entirely. The supporting cast continues making every scene richer. Conversations rarely feel like simple exchanges of information. Instead, they become opportunities for different ideas to collide. Those collisions create tension even when no action is taking place. The story also benefits from the fact that the stakes feel both personal and national at the same time. T'Challa's decisions affect his own future, but they also affect the future of Wakanda. That connection ensures that every choice carries weight. As more truths continue surfacing and more perspectives continue clashing, the atmosphere becomes increasingly uncertain. People who once seemed completely confident are beginning to question things. Assumptions that felt permanent are starting to look fragile. The future of Wakanda suddenly feels far less predictable than it did at the beginning of the movie, and that's exactly what makes everything so compelling to watch. One of the things I admire most about Black Panther is that it understands how powerful a good antagonist can be. A great hero becomes even more interesting when they're forced to confront someone who challenges their beliefs instead of simply threatening them physically. That's exactly what starts happening here. The conflict is no longer just about protecting Wakanda. It's becoming a debate about what Wakanda should be and what responsibilities come with the power it possesses. What makes these scenes so effective is that the movie keeps pushing T'Challa into uncomfortable territory. Earlier, many of the questions surrounding leadership felt theoretical. Now they're becoming impossible to ignore. Every new revelation forces him to reconsider something he once believed with complete confidence. Chadwick Boseman continues giving a performance built around thoughtfulness. T'Challa isn't the kind of character who reacts immediately to every situation. He listens. He observes. He reflects. That quality becomes increasingly important because the challenges facing him can't simply be solved through strength or technology. The more I watch these scenes, the more I appreciate how carefully Ryan Coogler constructed the story. The movie has been planting ideas from the very beginning. Questions about isolation, responsibility, history, and identity have always been present. Now those ideas are beginning to collide in ways that feel completely natural. Another thing that stands out is how much pressure leadership creates. Earlier, T'Challa was trying to prove he deserved the throne. Now he's realizing that earning power and using power wisely are two very different challenges. The movie constantly reminds us that leadership involves difficult choices, and those choices often come without perfect information. Nakia remains one of the most important voices in the story. Her perspective continues influencing T'Challa because she consistently focuses on people rather than systems. While others discuss policy, tradition, or security, Nakia often asks how decisions affect real lives. That human perspective becomes increasingly valuable as the conflict grows larger. Lupita Nyong'o brings so much warmth and conviction to the role that it's impossible not to understand why T'Challa values her opinion. Even when she's challenging long-standing beliefs, She never feels confrontational for the sake of conflict. She genuinely wants a better future. Okoye remains equally compelling. Danai Gurira gives the character such authority that every line feels meaningful. One thing I love about Okoye is that her loyalty never feels simple. She believes deeply in duty, but the movie constantly places her in situations where duty becomes complicated. Those moments reveal layers to the character that go far beyond the role of a traditional warrior. The visual presentation remains incredible. Wakanda still feels unlike any other place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The city, the landscapes, the technology, and the cultural details continue creating a sense of immersion that very few fictional worlds achieve. Rachel Morrison's cinematography deserves enormous praise because of how effectively it captures both beauty and emotion. Some of the most memorable images in the film aren't action scenes. They're moments where characters are simply processing difficult truths or confronting painful realities. Shuri continues bringing energy into every scene she enters. What I appreciate most is that her intelligence is always paired with curiosity. She isn't presented as someone who believes she already knows everything. She's constantly experimenting, learning, and pushing boundaries. That mindset makes her an important symbol of the future Wakanda could become. Letitia Wright's performance also helps keep the movie from becoming overly heavy. The story is dealing with increasingly serious issues, but Shuri's personality ensures that the film never loses its sense of humanity and warmth. Ryan Coogler's direction remains exceptional throughout these moments. What impresses me most is how confidently he allows characters to talk about ideas. Many blockbuster films are afraid audiences will lose interest if there isn't constant action. Black Panther understands that conversations can be just as engaging when the stakes are meaningful. The score by Ludwig Göransson continues adding tremendous emotional power. There are scenes where the music creates a sense of pride, sadness, or uncertainty before characters even speak. That's one of the reasons the soundtrack remains so memorable years after the movie's release. A production fact worth mentioning is that Black Panther won multiple Academy Awards, including awards for costume design, production design, and original score. Watching the film, those achievements make complete sense. Every aspect of the world feels carefully crafted and fully realized. What keeps everything engaging is that nobody seems completely comfortable anymore. Earlier in the story, many characters felt certain about their place in the world. Now uncertainty is spreading. Long-held assumptions are being questioned. New possibilities are emerging. The future feels open in a way it didn't before. The theme of legacy becomes even more important here. T'Challa inherited more than a title. He inherited decisions, beliefs, and consequences. Some of those things are sources of pride. Others are sources of conflict. The challenge is figuring out which parts of the past deserve preservation and which parts need to change. I think that's one of the reasons the movie connected with so many people. The questions it's asking aren't limited to Wakanda. They're universal questions about responsibility, history, and progress. How do people respect where they came from while still moving forward? How do they acknowledge mistakes without rejecting everything that came before? The supporting cast continues strengthening those themes because each major character represents a different answer. Nobody possesses the complete truth. Everyone is working with their own experiences, values, and priorities. That complexity keeps the story feeling grounded even as the stakes become increasingly large. The atmosphere keeps growing more intense because it feels like multiple visions of the future are moving toward a confrontation. Different ideas about leadership, responsibility, and identity are beginning to collide. The world T'Challa inherited is changing, and the choices he makes now will determine what comes next. As the story keeps moving forward, what impressed me most was how effectively the movie raises the emotional stakes without abandoning the larger themes that have been developing since the beginning. By now, the action, the politics, and the personal conflicts are all connected. Nothing feels separate anymore. Every decision affects everything else, and that's what gives this part of the film so much weight. One thing I kept noticing is how different Chala feels compared to the person we met at the start of the movie. He's still calm. He's still thoughtful. But there's a growing awareness in him now. Earlier, he was trying to live up to a legacy. Now he's trying to understand whether that legacy deserves to remain unchanged. That's a much more difficult challenge because it requires questioning people he deeply respects. Chadwick Boseman handles the evolution beautifully. He never turns Chala into a completely different character. Instead, he allows the audience to see subtle growth. The confidence is still there, but it's now accompanied by a deeper understanding of how complicated leadership can be. The movie continues exploring the consequences of isolation, and what I find fascinating is that it refuses to provide simple answers. It's easy to criticize Wakanda for remaining hidden, but the film also reminds viewers why that choice was made in the first place. The nation survived and prospered because it protected itself. The question isn't whether the decision made sense. The question is whether it still makes sense now. That's where the story becomes increasingly compelling. The world is changing, and Chala is beginning to realize that maintaining old policies may create new problems. At the same time, changing those policies could create risks that previous generations spent centuries trying to avoid. Nakia continues playing a crucial role in those discussions. Her perspective remains consistent because it's rooted in empathy. She sees opportunities to help people and believes those opportunities come with responsibilities. What I appreciate is that the movie never portrays her as someone chasing power or influence. Her motivations always feel genuine. Lupita Nyong'o gives the character so much sincerity that even simple conversations become meaningful. She doesn't need dramatic speeches to make an impact. Her conviction is evident in the way she carries herself and interacts with others. Okoye remains one of the strongest characters in the entire film. Danai Gurira has a remarkable ability to communicate emotion while maintaining the character's disciplined exterior. That's what makes Okoye so compelling. She often appears completely composed, yet viewers can still understand the internal conflicts she's facing. The movie benefits tremendously from these strong performances because the themes are becoming increasingly complex. Without believable characters, discussions about leadership, identity, and responsibility could easily feel abstract. Instead, everything remains grounded in people and relationships. Visually, Black Panther continues looking extraordinary. The filmmakers created a world that feels rich enough to support countless stories. Every location contributes something unique. The city feels alive. The technology feels integrated into daily life. Even small background details help reinforce the idea that Wakanda has a long and complicated history. Rachel Morrison's cinematography continues playing a huge role in that success. One thing I admire is how she captures both the beauty and scale of Wakanda without making it feel distant. The audience is constantly reminded that this is a place filled with real people rather than simply an impressive collection of buildings. Shuri continues bringing a sense of optimism into the story. While many characters are focused on history and tradition, she naturally gravitates toward innovation and possibility. That's one of the reasons she's such an important part of the movie. She represents the idea that progress doesn't have to come at the expense of identity. Letitia Wright's performance remains incredibly engaging. Shuri is funny, intelligent, and confident, but she also feels authentic. The character never comes across as someone written solely to deliver jokes or explain technology. She feels like a real person with her own perspective on the future. Ryan Coogler deserves enormous credit for how well he balances all of these different elements. The movie is discussing serious ideas while still functioning as a major blockbuster. It contains exciting action sequences, emotional character moments, political discussions, and personal drama, yet somehow none of those elements feel disconnected from each other. The score by Ludwig Göransson continues elevating every scene. There are moments where the music communicates emotions that characters aren't expressing directly. That's one of the signs of a truly great soundtrack. It doesn't just accompany the story. It becomes part of the storytelling itself. A production fact that always stands out to me is how much attention was given to making Wakanda feel culturally distinct. Every tribe has its own visual identity, customs, and traditions. Those differences help create a society that feels layered and believable rather than simplified. The emotional core of the movie keeps getting stronger because T'Challa's journey is becoming increasingly personal. Earlier, he was focused on proving himself as a ruler. Now he's confronting questions about who he wants to be as a leader. That's a more meaningful challenge because it doesn't have a clear finish line. What kept me completely invested during these scenes was the feeling that every character was being forced to make choices that revealed who they really are. When circumstances become difficult, people often discover what matters most to them. The movie understands that and uses it to deepen nearly every major relationship. The tension continues growing because different visions for Wakanda's future are becoming harder to reconcile. Some people want preservation. Others want transformation. Some believe caution is the wisest path. Others believe caution has already lasted too long. None of those perspectives feel entirely unreasonable, which makes the conflict far more interesting than a simple battle between right and wrong. And that's where the movie becomes especially powerful. It isn't asking whether Wakanda should change. It's asking how change should happen, who should guide it, and what responsibilities come with shaping the future of an entire nation. The further the movie goes, the more I appreciate how much confidence it has in its audience. It doesn't stop every few minutes to explain what viewers should think. Instead, it presents different perspectives, allows characters to defend those perspectives, and trusts the audience to decide where they stand. That's one of the reasons Black Panther feels more substantial than many blockbuster films. The story isn't built around simple answers. What really stands out during this stretch is how much the idea of identity continues shaping every major decision. T'Challa is trying to understand what it means to be king, but he's also trying to understand what Wakanda should represent moving forward. Those questions are connected because the future of the nation will inevitably reflect the values of the person leading it. Chadwick Boseman continues delivering a performance that feels remarkably grounded. One thing I always admired about his portrayal is that T'Challa never behaves like someone who believes leadership makes him more important than everyone else. If anything, leadership seems to make him more aware of his responsibilities. The higher his position becomes, the more carefully he weighs his decisions. That quality becomes increasingly important because the challenges facing him are no longer straightforward. Earlier in the story, there were specific threats and specific objectives. Now the conflict is becoming ideological. Different people want fundamentally different futures, and there isn't an obvious solution capable of satisfying everyone. The movie handles that complexity extremely well. Rather than reducing disagreements to personal rivalries, it focuses on the beliefs underneath those disagreements. Characters are fighting for ideas as much as they are fighting for outcomes. That's a major reason the story remains engaging even during scenes where nobody throws a punch. Nakia continues serving as one of the strongest voices advocating for a broader vision of responsibility. What I appreciate most about her is that she never loses sight of the human side of every issue. Policies, traditions, and strategies matter, but Nakia consistently asks how those things affect real people. That perspective remains incredibly valuable throughout the film. Lupita Nyong'o brings a sense of sincerity to the role that makes every conversation feel important. She doesn't need dramatic moments to leave an impression. The strength of the character comes from conviction. Nakia knows what she believes, and that certainty influences everyone around her. Okoye remains equally compelling for different reasons. Danai Gurira gives the character an incredible sense of presence. Every scene involving Okoye feels meaningful because viewers understand how seriously she takes her responsibilities. Her loyalty isn't blind. It's rooted in a genuine belief that protecting Wakanda is the most important duty she has. What makes her especially interesting is that the movie constantly challenges that belief without dismissing it. The story respects her perspective even when other characters disagree. That's something Black Panther does exceptionally well. It treats opposing viewpoints with seriousness rather than turning them into easy targets. Visually, the film continues looking phenomenal. Wakanda remains one of the most memorable settings ever created for a superhero movie. Every location feels intentional. Every design choice contributes to the larger identity of the nation. Even after spending so much time in this world, it still feels rich with detail. Rachel Morrison's cinematography plays a huge role in maintaining that sense of immersion. The camera constantly reminds viewers of both the beauty and significance of Wakanda. Whether focusing on large landscapes or intimate character moments, the visuals remain consistently impressive. Shuri continues being one of the most enjoyable characters in the movie. What I love about her is that she represents possibility. While many characters spend their time debating history, Shuri naturally looks toward the future. Her intelligence allows her to imagine solutions that others might never consider. Letitia Wright's performance gives the character a sense of energy that helps balance the increasingly serious tone of the story. Even during tense moments, Shuri remains curious, optimistic, and confident. Those qualities make her incredibly easy to root for. Ryan Coogler's direction continues impressing me because of how naturally everything fits together. The action, themes, humor, emotional moments, and world-building all feel connected. Nothing seems included simply because a blockbuster movie is expected to have it. Every element serves a purpose. The score by Ludwig Göransson remains one of the movie's greatest strengths. There are scenes where the music creates a feeling of anticipation long before the story reveals why that feeling matters. The soundtrack constantly enhances the emotional impact of important moments without drawing attention away from the characters. A production fact worth highlighting is how many departments work together to create a unified vision of Wakanda. The costumes, music, production design, visual effects, and cinematography all support the same creative goals. That's one of the reasons the world feels so believable. Everything appears to belong together. The emotional stakes keep increasing because the questions facing T'Challa are becoming more personal. He's no longer evaluating ideas from a distance. The consequences of those ideas are directly affecting the people he cares about and the future he's responsible for protecting. What kept me completely engaged during these scenes was the growing realization that every character is being tested. Their beliefs, loyalties, and priorities are all under pressure. Some people become more certain when challenged. Others begin questioning assumptions they once accepted without hesitation. The movie understands that meaningful change rarely happens without conflict. Different visions of the future are competing for influence, and those visions are becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. Every conversation seems to carry additional weight because everyone involved understands how much is at stake. The atmosphere continues becoming more intense as long-standing ideas collide with new possibilities. T'Challa is learning that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about listening, learning, and finding the courage to act when no option feels completely safe. The more the story explores that idea, the stronger it becomes. One thing that kept impressing me throughout this part of the movie was how naturally everything that came before starts paying off. The conversations about leadership, the debates about responsibility, the questions surrounding Wakanda's role in the world, none of those ideas feel separate anymore. They're all becoming part of the same larger conflict, and that's what gives the story so much momentum. What I especially like is that T'Challa's journey remains the emotional center of everything. The movie never forgets that this is ultimately a story about a man trying to decide what kind of leader he wants to be. The larger issues matter because they force him to confront that question from different angles. Chadwick Boseman continues delivering one of the most controlled performances in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. T'Challa rarely raises his voice. He rarely tries to dominate scenes through force of personality. Yet whenever he's on screen, the audience pays attention. That's because Boseman understood that real authority often comes from confidence rather than volume. The deeper the story goes, the more complicated T'Challa's position becomes. Earlier, Many of his challenges involved understanding the responsibilities he inherited. Now he's being forced to decide which parts of that inheritance deserve protection and which parts need to change. That's an incredibly difficult position because every decision risks disappointing someone. The movie handles that tension remarkably well. It never presents change as easy, and it never presents tradition as automatically correct. Instead, it explores the difficult space between those two ideas. That's where most of the drama comes from, and it's also where much of the movie's emotional depth comes from. Nakia continues playing a vital role in shaping T'Challa's thinking. What makes her such an effective character is that she constantly reminds people to look beyond themselves. While many discussions focus on what is best for Wakanda, Nakia often focuses on what is right. Those aren't always the same thing, and the movie repeatedly explores the difference. Lupita Nyong'o brings warmth and intelligence to every scene. The relationship between Nakia and T'Challa works because it's built on mutual respect. They don't always agree, but they genuinely value each other's perspective. That dynamic makes their conversations feel meaningful. Okoye remains one of the film's most fascinating characters. Danai Gurira gives such a strong performance that even moments of silence feel important. What I appreciate most is how committed Okoye remains to her principles. She doesn't change her beliefs simply because circumstances become difficult. Instead, the movie forces her to examine those beliefs under increasing pressure. The supporting cast as a whole continues doing excellent work. Every major character feels like they belong in this world. Nobody exists solely to support the protagonist. Everyone has goals, priorities, and opinions that contribute to the larger story. Visually, the movie remains stunning. Even after spending so much time in Wakanda, the world never loses its sense of wonder. The filmmakers created a setting that feels both futuristic and deeply connected to its history. That's an incredibly difficult balance to achieve, and it's one of the reasons the film remains so memorable. Rachel Morrison's cinematography continues playing a huge role in that success. One thing I noticed during these scenes is how effectively the camera captures emotion. Large-scale visuals are impressive, but some of the movie's strongest moments come from focusing on a character's reaction to difficult news or a challenging decision. Shuri continues bringing energy into every scene she appears in. What I enjoy most is that her optimism never feels naive. She's aware of the challenges facing Wakanda, but she still believes solutions are possible. That perspective becomes increasingly important as tensions continue rising. Letitia Wright's performance remains one of the highlights of the film. Shuri's intelligence is obvious, but it's her enthusiasm and confidence that make the character so memorable. She represents the possibility of a future that isn't limited by old assumptions. Ryan Coogler deserves enormous credit for maintaining the balance between spectacle and substance. Many blockbuster films eventually become consumed by action. Black Panther never loses interest in its characters. Even when the stakes become enormous, the story remains focused on people and ideas rather than just events. The score by Ludwig Göransson continues elevating every important moment. There are scenes where the music creates a sense of anticipation and emotion before the dialogue even begins. That's one of the reasons the soundtrack became so celebrated. It feels completely connected to the identity of the movie. A production fact that stands out is how much effort went into making Wakanda feel like a nation with multiple viewpoints rather than a single unified voice. Different tribes, different leaders, and different perspectives all contribute to the story. That complexity makes the world feel far more believable. The emotional stakes continue growing because the future of Wakanda no longer feels abstract. The decisions being made now will affect generations to come. That's a huge responsibility, and the movie consistently reminds viewers of that fact. What kept me invested throughout these scenes was the sense that everyone was being forced to reveal who they really are. It's easy to hold beliefs when circumstances are comfortable. It's much harder when those beliefs are tested. The story repeatedly places characters in situations where they have to choose between convenience and conviction. The tension continues building because different visions of Wakanda's future are moving closer and closer toward direct conflict. People who once shared common goals are beginning to realize they have very different ideas about how those goals should be achieved. That disagreement creates an atmosphere where every conversation feels important. The more the movie explores these ideas, the more it becomes clear that T'Challa's greatest challenge isn't defeating an enemy. It's deciding what kind of future deserves to be built and finding the courage to pursue it even when doing so comes with significant risks. What I found most interesting during this part of the movie is how the discussion about power keeps evolving. Earlier, power was mostly connected to leadership, tradition, and responsibility. Now the story starts focusing on what people choose to do once they have that power. That's an important distinction because possessing power and using it wisely are completely different challenges. The movie continues benefiting from the fact that its conflict is rooted in ideas rather than simple rivalry. That's one of the reasons Black Panther remains memorable. The characters aren't just fighting over who wins. They're fighting over what the future should look like. Every major decision carries weight because it reflects a larger belief about the world. Chadwick Boseman remains excellent throughout these scenes. What always impresses me about his performance is how much emotion he communicates through restraint. T'Challa rarely reacts impulsively. Even when he's under enormous pressure, he tries to understand situations before responding to them. That quality makes him feel like a genuine leader rather than someone simply occupying a position of authority. The emotional burden he carries becomes increasingly visible. Earlier in the story, much of his focus was on honoring his father's legacy. Now he's beginning to understand that honoring a legacy doesn't necessarily mean preserving every decision connected to it. That's a difficult lesson because it requires separating respect from unquestioning acceptance. One thing I appreciate is that the movie never treats growth as a betrayal of tradition. Instead, it suggests that growth can be another way of honoring what came before. T'Challa isn't rejecting Wakanda. He's trying to understand how Wakanda can become something even better. Nakia continues serving as one of the strongest influences on that journey. Her perspective remains incredibly important because she constantly pushes the conversation beyond borders and politics. She reminds people that power creates obligations. Having the ability to help others raises questions about whether choosing not to help is a decision in itself. Lupita Nyong'o brings so much conviction to the role that every conversation involving Nakia feels meaningful. She never comes across as someone trying to win an argument. She genuinely wants people to consider possibilities they may have ignored for too long. Okoye remains equally compelling. Danai Gurira's performance continues giving the character a tremendous sense of dignity and strength. What makes Okoye fascinating is that her loyalty never feels simplistic. The movie repeatedly places her in situations where different values come into conflict, and watching her navigate those conflicts becomes one of the most engaging parts of the story. The supporting cast continues elevating nearly every scene. That's one of the advantages of having such a strong ensemble. Different characters represent different viewpoints, and those viewpoints help make the world feel more complete. Nobody exists solely to agree with the protagonist. Visually, the movie remains extraordinary. Wakanda still feels like one of the most fully realized settings in modern blockbuster filmmaking. Every location contributes something unique. The technology feels integrated into the culture. The architecture reflects history as well as innovation. Everything appears connected to a larger vision. Rachel Morrison's cinematography continues helping that vision come alive. Some of the most powerful moments in the film aren't action scenes at all. They're moments where characters are forced to confront difficult truths or make important decisions. The camera consistently knows when to emphasize scale and when to focus entirely on emotion. Shuri remains one of the movie's most enjoyable characters. What I appreciate is how naturally she represents the future. She respects her culture, but she's never limited by assumptions about what is or isn't possible. That perspective becomes increasingly valuable as the story continues exploring questions about change and progress. Letitia Wright's performance brings a contagious energy to the role. Even during serious scenes, Shuri's confidence and curiosity help keep the movie feeling alive. She's a reminder that innovation often begins with people willing to imagine something different. Ryan Coogler continues demonstrating remarkable control over the material. The movie is balancing action, political discussions, family dynamics, world building, and philosophical questions, yet everything still feels connected. That's an incredibly difficult achievement, especially in a film operating on this scale. The score by Ludwig Göransson remains phenomenal. One thing I noticed during these scenes is how effectively the music supports emotional transitions. Moments of reflection feel more meaningful because of the score. Moments of tension feel more intense. The soundtrack constantly strengthens what the characters are experiencing. A production fact worth mentioning is that Black Panther became one of the highest-grossing superhero films ever released. What's impressive is that it achieved that success while remaining deeply focused on character and theme. The movie never relies solely on spectacle. It trusts audiences to engage with ideas as well as action. The emotional side of the story keeps getting stronger because the consequences of every decision feel increasingly real. Earlier, many of the debates surrounding Wakanda's future felt theoretical. Now those debates are affecting relationships, priorities, and the direction of the nation itself. What kept me fully invested was the way the movie continues challenging assumptions. Every time a character seems completely certain about something, the story introduces a new perspective that complicates the situation. That approach keeps the audience engaged because it encourages constant reevaluation. The atmosphere grows more intense with each passing scene. Different visions for Wakanda's future are becoming harder to reconcile. Long-standing beliefs are being tested. People who once seemed united are finding themselves pulled toward different conclusions about what should happen next. What makes all of this work is that the movie never loses sight of the human element. The discussions about power, responsibility, and identity matter because they affect real people. T'Challa's decisions matter because they affect lives. The future of Wakanda matters because audiences have spent so much time understanding the people who call it home. One of the strongest things about Black Panther is that the deeper it gets into its story, the clearer it becomes that the movie isn't really obsessed with power. It's obsessed with responsibility. Plenty of characters have access to power throughout the film. The real question is what they believe that power should be used for. That's the idea connecting almost every major conflict, and it's what keeps the movie feeling meaningful even when the action becomes larger and more intense. T'Challa's journey continues being the heart of everything. Looking back at where he started, it's remarkable how much he's changed without ever feeling like a completely different person. The qualities that made him admirable at the beginning are still there. He's still thoughtful. He's still respectful. He's still committed to protecting his people. The difference is that his understanding of leadership has become much deeper. Chadwick Boseman deserves enormous credit for that evolution. Lesser performances often signal character growth through dramatic personality changes. Boseman takes a much subtler approach. T'Challa grows because his perspective grows. The audience can see him learning, questioning, and adapting while still remaining recognizably himself. What I appreciate most is that the movie never presents wisdom as something a person achieves once and then keeps forever. T'Challa is constantly learning from the people around him. He learns from Nakia. He learns from Okoye. He learns from Shuri. He even learns from people he disagrees with. That willingness to listen becomes one of his greatest strengths as a leader. Nakia continues playing an important role because she consistently pushes conversations beyond immediate concerns. While others often focus on protecting what already exists, she keeps asking what more could be done. Lupita Nyong'o brings such sincerity to the role that those questions never feel political or strategic. They feel personal. What makes Nakia compelling is that she sees possibilities where other people see risks. The movie never suggests she's perfect, but it does show how valuable it can be to have someone willing to imagine a different future. Okoye remains equally important for different reasons. Danai Gurira gives one of the most disciplined performances in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Every action, every reaction, and every decision feels completely true to the character. Even when circumstances become increasingly difficult, Okoye never stops being Okoye. The movie benefits enormously from that consistency because it makes every choice feel earned. Characters aren't changing simply because the plot requires them to. They're responding according to values that have been established from the beginning. Visually, the film remains incredible. Wakanda still feels like a place that exists beyond the story being told. That's one of the highest compliments I can give a fictional setting. Even when the camera focuses on major events, there's a sense that millions of other lives are continuing beyond the edges of the frame. The work done by Hannah Beachler, Ruthie Carter, Rachel Morrison, and the rest of the creative team cannot be praised enough. They didn't simply create a backdrop. They created a world. Every costume, location, and visual detail contributes to a larger sense of identity. Shuri continues representing one of the most hopeful aspects of the story. What I like about her character is that she approaches problems with curiosity rather than fear. While many people spend time debating whether change should happen, Shuri naturally starts thinking about how change could happen. Letitia Wright's performance remains full of energy and confidence. Even during serious moments, Shuri never loses the qualities that make her unique. She remains intelligent, creative, and optimistic. Those traits become increasingly important as the story moves toward bigger decisions. Ryan Coogler's direction continues impressing me because he never loses control of the film's priorities. The action is exciting, but it never overshadows the characters. The themes are meaningful, but they never overwhelm the entertainment value. Balancing those elements is extremely difficult, and Coogler handles it remarkably well. The score by Ludwig Göransson remains one of the best aspects of the movie. There are moments where the music alone creates a feeling of pride, sadness, determination, or hope. That's one of the reasons the soundtrack remains so memorable. It doesn't simply support the story. It becomes part of the story's emotional identity. A production fact that always stands out is that Black Panther became the first superhero movie ever nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. Whether someone agrees with every Oscar decision or not, that achievement says a lot about how the film was received. It wasn't viewed as just another comic book adaptation. It was viewed as a significant piece of filmmaking. The emotional stakes continue feeling incredibly strong because the movie has spent so much time developing its characters. Audiences understand why these people believe what they believe. They understand the fears, hopes, and experiences shaping their decisions. That understanding makes every conflict more engaging. What kept me invested throughout these scenes was the realization that the future of Wakanda isn't really being decided by technology or tradition alone. It's being decided by people. Different people with different values, different experiences, and different ideas about what responsibility looks like. The movie constantly returns to that idea. Systems matter. Technology matters. History matters. But ultimately, people are the ones making choices. The future depends on how those choices are made and what principles guide them. The atmosphere becomes increasingly emotional because so many of the questions raised earlier in the movie are now impossible to avoid. What does Wakanda owe the world? What does leadership require? How should people respond to mistakes made by previous generations? The film has been building toward those questions from the very beginning, and now they feel more important than ever. What makes this journey so compelling is that T'Challa isn't searching for an easy answer. He's searching for the right answer, and those are rarely the same thing. Every lesson he's learned, every perspective he's encountered, and every challenge he's faced has helped shape the leader he's becoming. The result is a story that feels bigger than a superhero adventure because it's ultimately about growth, responsibility, and the courage to imagine a better future. What I think makes the final stretch of Black Panther so effective is that the movie never forgets the questions it asked at the beginning. A lot of blockbuster films introduce interesting themes and then abandon them once the action starts. Here, the action and the themes continue moving together. Every major decision still connects back to responsibility, leadership, identity, and the future of Wakanda. Looking at T'Challa's journey as a whole, it's clear that he has evolved in ways that go far beyond becoming a stronger fighter. In fact, physical strength was never really the issue. From the beginning, he was capable, intelligent, and respected. The challenge was learning how to lead in a world that was more complicated than he initially believed. That's what makes Chadwick Boseman's performance so memorable. T'Challa's growth comes from understanding rather than dominance. He doesn't become a better leader because he gains more power. He becomes a better leader because he gains a broader perspective. He starts listening more carefully. He starts questioning more honestly. And perhaps most importantly, he becomes willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. One thing I kept appreciating throughout these scenes is how much the movie values empathy. Many characters spend the story arguing about what should happen next, but the people who make the greatest impact are often the ones capable of understanding perspectives different from their own. That quality becomes increasingly important because the future of Wakanda depends on more than protecting borders or maintaining traditions. It depends on understanding how actions affect people. That's a lesson T'Challa gradually learns, and it's one of the reasons his character arc feels so satisfying. Nakia continues representing that idea extremely well. Throughout the film, she's encouraged others to think beyond what is familiar and comfortable. Her perspective has always been rooted in helping people rather than preserving systems, and the movie consistently demonstrates the value of that approach. Lupita Nyong'o brings so much heart to the role that Nakia never feels like a character delivering themes. She feels like a real person whose experiences have shaped her worldview. That's one of the reasons her conversations with T'Challa remain some of the strongest moments in the movie. Okoye also continues being one of the film's most compelling characters. What makes her so interesting is that she never abandons her principles. Instead, she constantly examines how those principles apply to changing circumstances. Danai Gurira gives every scene a sense of conviction that makes even simple moments feel important. The relationship between duty and personal belief remains one of the movie's most fascinating ideas, and Okoye embodies that tension better than almost anyone else in the story. Shuri continues bringing energy and optimism into the narrative as well. What I love about her character is that she represents possibility. She looks at problems and immediately starts thinking about solutions. While others debate what should happen, Shuri often focuses on what can happen. Letitia Wright's performance remains one of the highlights of the film. Her confidence never feels forced. Her intelligence never feels exaggerated. Shuri feels like someone genuinely excited about discovering new ideas, and that enthusiasm becomes contagious. Visually, the movie remains stunning right through these scenes. Wakanda still feels alive. The world building remains one of the greatest achievements in modern blockbuster filmmaking. Every location feels connected to a larger culture, and every design choice contributes to the identity of the nation. Rachel Morrison's cinematography continues supporting both the spectacle and the emotional storytelling. The movie understands that beautiful visuals are most effective when they serve the characters rather than distract from them. Ryan Coogler's direction deserves enormous praise because of how confidently he balances all of these elements. The film contains action, humor, drama, political discussions, family conflict, and philosophical questions, yet it never feels overwhelmed by any of them. Everything works together toward the same goal. The score by Ludwig Göransson remains phenomenal. Some soundtracks support scenes. This soundtrack helps define them. The music creates a sense of history, pride, and emotion that becomes inseparable from the experience of watching the movie. A production fact that always impresses me is how many aspects of Black Panther became influential after its release. The visual design, costumes, music, and world-building all left a lasting impact. The film wasn't simply successful during its theatrical run. It continued influencing conversations about blockbuster filmmaking for years afterward. The emotional side of the story remains strong because the movie has invested so much time in developing its characters. Audiences care about these people. They understand what motivates them. They understand what they fear. They understand what they're fighting for. That emotional investment makes every decision feel important. What kept me fully engaged during these scenes was the realization that Wakanda's future is no longer being defined solely by its past. Earlier, tradition seemed to provide answers for almost every question. Now the nation is entering a period where new answers must be created. That's a challenging process because change always involves uncertainty. There are risks associated with remaining the same, and there are risks associated with moving forward. The movie never pretends otherwise. Instead, it acknowledges that leadership often means choosing between imperfect options. The story keeps returning to the idea that growth requires courage. Not just physical courage, but the courage to question assumptions, admit mistakes, and imagine something different. T'Challa's journey embodies that idea beautifully because his greatest victories come through understanding rather than force. The more I think about it, the more I believe that's why Black Panther connected with so many people. Beneath all the action and spectacle, it's a story about learning from the past without becoming trapped by it. It's a story about responsibility, empathy, and the willingness to build a future that reflects the lessons of history rather than simply repeating it. What really stands out to me as the movie reaches its final phase is how completely T'Challa has changed his understanding of leadership. When the story began, he viewed leadership largely through the lens of tradition. He respected the systems that had protected Wakanda for generations, and he believed his responsibility was to preserve them. By this point, however, he has come to understand that leadership is not just about protecting what already exists. It is also about recognizing when change is necessary. That realization doesn't happen overnight. The movie spends its entire runtime earning it. Every conversation, every challenge, every uncomfortable truth pushes T'Challa toward a broader understanding of the world. That's why his growth feels believable. The story never forces it. Instead, it develops naturally through experience. Chadwick Boseman's performance remains the foundation that holds everything together. Looking back over the entire film, what impresses me most is how much he accomplishes without ever making T'Challa feel overly dramatic. The character is often quiet, yet he's never passive. He listens, observes, and learns. Those qualities become increasingly important because the future he is helping shape requires wisdom more than it requires strength. One thing I appreciate is that the movie never presents leadership as a destination. T'Challa doesn't suddenly become perfect once he learns certain lessons. If anything, he becomes more aware of how much responsibility comes with his position. The more he understands, the more carefully he approaches decisions. That's a very human way to portray growth. Nakia continues playing a huge role in that growth. Throughout the movie, she consistently challenged assumptions that others accepted without question. She saw opportunities where others saw danger. More importantly, she refused to separate power from responsibility. Lupita Nyong'o gives the character so much authenticity that her perspective never feels like a message being delivered to the audience. It feels like a genuine belief shaped by real experiences. That's why her role in the story remains so important. She helps expand T'Challa's understanding of what Wakanda could become. Okoye remains one of the strongest supporting characters in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Danai Gurira brings such conviction to the role that every decision feels meaningful. What makes Okoye fascinating is that she never abandons her principles, even when circumstances become complicated. Instead, she finds ways to remain true to those principles while adapting to a changing reality. The movie benefits enormously from having characters like Okoye and Nakia because they challenge T'Challa in different ways. One pushes him to think about duty. The other pushes him to think about responsibility beyond borders. Together, they help shape the leader he becomes. Shuri continues representing the future of Wakanda. Her intelligence, optimism, and creativity make her one of the most memorable characters in the film. What I love most is that she approaches problems with excitement rather than fear. She sees possibilities where others see obstacles. Letitia Wright's performance adds so much energy to the story. Even during serious moments, Shuri remains a source of hope and innovation. She reminds everyone that progress doesn't have to mean abandoning identity. It can mean finding new ways to express it. Visually, the movie remains extraordinary. Even after spending so much time in Wakanda, the world never loses its sense of wonder. That's a testament to the work of the entire creative team. Every location feels intentional. Every design choice supports the larger identity of the nation. The costume design by Ruth E. Carter deserves special recognition. The costumes don't simply look impressive. They tell stories about the people wearing them. Status, tradition, personality, and history are all communicated through visual design. That's one of the reasons the world feels so rich and believable. Rachel Morrison's cinematography continues capturing both the scale of Wakanda and the emotions of its people. The movie constantly balances grand visuals with intimate character moments, and that balance helps keep the audience emotionally connected throughout the story. Ryan Coogler's direction remains exceptional. What impresses me most is how confidently he allows ideas to drive the narrative. The action is exciting, but it never overshadows the themes. The world building is impressive, but it never overshadows the characters. Everything works together toward a common purpose. The score by Ludwig Göransson remains one of the defining strengths of the movie. There are moments where the music creates a sense of pride, loss, determination, and hope all at once. Few superhero films have soundtracks this distinctive, and it's a major reason the movie feels so memorable. A production fact worth mentioning is that Black Panther became one of the most celebrated films in Marvel history not simply because of its box office success, but because of the conversations it inspired. People discussed its characters, themes, and world long after leaving the theater. That's usually the sign of a movie that has connected on a deeper level. The emotional impact of the story remains strong because it ultimately focuses on people rather than spectacle. Technology matters. Traditions matter. Politics matter. But what matters most are the choices people make and the values guiding those choices. What kept me invested throughout the entire movie was the feeling that T'Challa was becoming the kind of leader Wakanda needed rather than simply the kind of leader Wakanda expected. That's an important distinction. Expectations are often based on the past. Leadership requires preparing for the future. The movie constantly returns to the idea that progress and tradition don't have to be enemies. The challenge is finding a balance between them. T'Challa's journey is largely about discovering that balance and understanding that preserving a nation's identity doesn't mean refusing to evolve. By this point, Black Panther has firmly established itself as more than a superhero movie. It's a story about legacy, responsibility, leadership, and the courage to imagine a better future. Those ideas have been present from the very beginning, and they remain just as powerful now as they were when the journey started. That's my review of Black Panther. What makes this movie special isn't just the action, the technology, or even the world of Wakanda itself. It's the way the story combines all of those elements with meaningful questions about leadership, responsibility, identity, and legacy. Ryan Coogler created a film that feels much bigger than a typical superhero adventure. Chadwick Boseman delivered a performance that gave T'Challa strength, dignity, and humanity. The supporting cast brought depth to every scene, while the visuals, music, costumes, and world building helped create one of the most memorable settings ever seen in a comic book movie. Years later, Black Panther still stands out because it understands that the most powerful stories aren't just about heroes defeating enemies. They're about people learning, growing, and finding the courage to make difficult choices when the future is uncertain. Whether you're watching it for the first time or revisiting it again, there's always something new to appreciate, from the performances and themes to the incredible attention to detail that went into bringing Wakanda to life. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this review, let me know what you think about Black Panther and where it ranks among your favorite Marvel movies. And as always, I'll see you in the next review.